So I was the associate pastor for adult education and worship, and I served at Fourth Church between 2006 and 2014. I had decided, because I was in a job that I was enjoying, that I wanted to go live in a big city for a while. And so I was exclusively applying for calls in New York and San Francisco and Atlanta, and Chicago was on the list. And by the time that the opportunity came up at Fourth and I applied for that position, I had not gotten my foot in the door in most of those cities in some pretty great congregations. And I was just kind of blown away that this was the one that worked out, because Fourth is such an incredible place. One of the neat things about working at Fourth is, between the location and the scope of the church and that kind of thing, there are just so many tremendous resources. I think that in my time there, we shifted from a model of education that was focused on a lot of kind of seminary for regular church folks, kind of curriculum, to things that were maybe a little bit more practically based, and really tried to draw on some of the resources of the city beyond the kind of seminary or theological world. And that might have been one of the shifts that we made. We also, what else would I say? I also tried to do some things that maybe drew upon the combination of the different positions that I had. So the part of the worship portion of my job was to manage the wonderful music program that we have at Fourth. And there are really strong resources for theological education within the music and arts community. And so we really tried to grow some of that too, and see the education program, the Academy for Faith and Life, not so much as a siloed program, but one that really wove through the tissue of the church. The obvious one that I'm sure a lot of the interviewees are going to mention is John Buchanan, who, his mentoring was always out of a very interesting place, because he did not fancy himself as a mentor, even though, countless people claim him as one. And so without any kind of, posturing in that way, and really from a very humble perspective, he was somebody who, taught me so much of what I know about everything from, preaching a good sermon to making sure you do a good job returning your phone calls. But in addition to the professional stuff, John is just another father figure and mentor in my life, to whom I point for all kinds of things. The other person who comes immediately to mind is Dana Ferguson. And in some ways, Dana comes to mind out of a place of some amount of regret for me, because she was my supervisor when I started on the staff. I was just a couple of years out of seminary. I thought I knew everything, when the reality was I had so much to learn and still do. And I did not appreciate at the time what an incredible mentor Dana was. And I know, looking back, even though I didn't appreciate it at the time, how much I gained from watching her lead a staff and being a part of that. In particular, and apart from the management side of it, Dana's preaching and her prayers were just incredibly formative in my ministry. And the thing that I would point to in the midst of that is that, when Dana got sick, and and we all, after she died, looked back at the months before that, and could see that she seemed to have a sense of what was coming, and she preached and prayed into that in a public way that all of us were gifted by. And I have found in my own ministry that particularly when there's a really hard funeral that comes along because somebody hasn't lived the the full life that we all hope for, but has died too young or has lost a child, or any number of the pastoral situations that are really hard. It's Dana's wisdom that I look to as a preacher, and I frequently quote from things that she said in those late parts of her life, because it's wisdom that I don't have access to, not having had that experience. I'd say there's a very strong parallel between Fourth and the dynamics of that place and Knox, where I serve today. Fourth is a very large church and Knox is smaller, but many of the programmatic dynamics of the church are the same. And this is still, by the standards of the PCUSA, a fairly large congregation. And so my professional experience and the kind of management skills that I learned as part of the staff at Fourth have been very transferable to my time here. And at the same time, you learn, I think there's great blessing to the size and scope of Fourth and what that allows us to do. I remember very clearly the experience of doing a memorial service for Douglas Voiles when he passed away. And you'll remember that, Doug was a total church mouse. I mean, he was in there every time the door was open. If you were teaching a class, he was in a chair. And in the context of a big place like Fourth, he was not somebody who served in positions of great influences in the congregation. He was not somebody who was throwing his weight around in particular ways and making himself visible. But he was always there, always willing, and always engaged. And Doug, who got sick kind of suddenly and died, and didn't have family to speak of, surrounding him at that time, had one of the biggest funerals that I presided over at Fourth. People just came in droves, and I had more phone calls than I can remember from people in our men's group saying, is it too forward of me to ask if I can be a pallbearer? Do you need ushers? How can I help? I want to honor the life of this man. And I think that's the story that I wanted to tell, not only because of my fond memories of Doug and of the church, but because in a big place like Fourth, that was a moment of us. And it's one of many examples of where, it's still a church. It's a community of believers who are connected to one another and who care about every one of God's children. And I'll always remember that memorial service. I'll name two things. One, it's just a really neat thing and a increasingly rare thing maybe in Presbyterian ministry to work in a place where you've got so many amazing colleagues gathered in the same place. Mm-hmm. There aren't a lot of situations that are quite so multi-staff, and I was a part of an incredibly talented group of people. So often I felt like I was just lucky to be there, and it was just a really fun place to be, especially in that kind of early developmental place in my ministry. And related to that, what's better than being on Michigan Avenue in the middle of all of it when you're just out of seminary and have a possibility to kind of go wherever you want. It was just so neat to live in Chicago and to be able to embrace all that was at that time in my life. And I'm thankful for that time.